On this Independence Day weekend, I'd like to think and reflect about freedom, not in political terms, but in theological terms. Stay tuned. Hello, friends. Pastor Tim Westermeyer here. Thank you for spending a little time with me today. This episode is airing on Saturday, July 3rd. So tomorrow, of course, is the national holiday, the 4th of July, a celebration of independence from England and Great Britain during the Revolutionary War. One of the big themes of that, of course, is our freedom from oppression from that other country at that time. And so I actually am thinking today of that word freedom, but not in political terms or terms related to nations warring one another, but rather in theological terms. And I'm actually thinking of it in terms of the gentleman who gives this church its name, namely the Lutheran Church, namely Martin Luther. I just did an episode about the Augsburg Confessions. We talked a little bit about the history of this tradition. And I have discussed this in other places, but it seems appropriate to bring it up again. Martin Luther lived at a time when the German language had not yet been sort of set in stone in terms of the written form of the language. In fact, one of his gifts to the German language was precisely that. Through his translation of the Bible, he sort of reinforced what we would call today modern written German. One of the side effects of the fact that it was not yet really written down consistently was that people's last names during his lifetime were spelled in different ways. So his own father, Hans Luther, did not spell his last name L-U-T-H-E-R. He spelled it various other ways. Why is it spelled L-U-T-H-E-R then to us? Well, it's spelled that way because Martin Luther, like many other people around the time that he lived, took a Greek word and used it to sort of give him a new last name. In his case, it sounded like his father's last name, but it was spelled differently. The Greek word that Luther chose was a word, Eleutheria, from which L-U-T-H-E-R is derived, and that word means freed, or the freed one, or I have been freed. And so Luther was claiming in his very name, in that Greekicized spelling of it, that I, Martin Luther, have been freed. And of course, what he was talking about was being freed from sin, death, and the devil through the love of Jesus. And that still is theologically true for us today in 2021. There's no question about any of that. Culturally, though, I'm not sure that that gets us very far with people maybe who aren't members of churches, for example. I'm not sure they don't wake up in the morning necessarily and say, well, I'm in bondage to sin, as we confess in our confessions, or I'm worried about how the devil is tempting me today. So very briefly, and this is, again, as always with these short episodes, this isn't exhaustive. We could say a lot more about it. I would actually welcome your thoughts about this. But one way to think about being in bondage in 2021, and it's not contrary to those theological categories of sin, death, and the devil, but it maybe gives them a little bit more purchase during our lives today, would be words like we live with guilt or shame, or resentment, or pain from something that happened in the past. And why are those things, why do they enslave us? Why are we in bondage to them if we feel them? We're in bondage to them in part because all those things, guilt, shame, resentment, pain, tend to focus us on what? Ourselves. If I'm feeling a lot of guilt, if I'm feeling a lot of shame, if I'm feeling resentment, I'm preoccupied with me. And I'm sort of playing in my own mind, oh, well, what have I done wrong? And gosh, I feel terrible about it. And it's really hard to break out from that. We are, again, it's a theological category, we are curved in on ourselves, we would say, which is sort of one of the primal sins. So to be freed from that allows us to do what? It allows us to stop thinking about ourselves so that we can do what God calls us to do, which is turn to our neighbor in need and say, how can I help you? How can I be of service to you? How can I demonstrate God's love to you. If we're so wrapped up in ourselves with all of those other things, it prevents us from turning to our neighbor. And if we recognize that God is saying to each of us, I love you, I forgive you, you have been freed from those past burdens, it allows us again to do what God calls and challenges and invites us to do in our lives. So again, Martin Luther, he maybe didn't always live that out perfectly. We can talk about him another time, but he certainly claimed that freedom even through his very name. On this Independence Day weekend, I pray that we also might be able to claim the freedom that God gives us so that we can turn to our neighbor in love. Thanks as always for being with me. Be well, stay in touch, and God bless.